Hello, so it's pretty late. I'll try not to make this too long, but I want to speak a little bit about Holocaust Memorial Day and some of the issues around that, as well as 75 years since the end of the Siege of Leningrad. These were two of the darkest events in human history. I'll start with the Holocaust. Um, I find it staggering. I find it staggering that there are still people who believe that it didn't happen, and there are still people who pollute the internet with anti Semitic conspiracy theories. I find that just staggering. Um, Without question, the Holocaust was one of the biggest crimes in human history. Um, and it's quite something to think that this was within living memory. You know, there's people alive today who went through that, and it is getting further back in time. But just as we remembered the centenary of the First World War ending last year, I don't think we should ever forget the scale of this. And that brings me to the point about, there's been a kind of something of a backlash. And of course that's from predictable far right groups who just deny plainly that it happened. But there's also those who don't deny it happened. They acknowledge it happened, but they question why are other groups not remembered. I'm not sure if that's the case actually. So let's just look at a fact. Yes, the Nazis targeted Jewish people, but they are also targeted Slavs, Roma, the disabled, the mentally impaired, um, other minority groups, and political opponents, communists, socialists, Freemasons, um, and homosexuals. So there were other groups targeted, of course there were, and thousands of them died. So if you were black or gay or a Roma in 1930s Germany, it would have been a very scary time. And like I said, many thousands also died. But all the studies on the Holocaust, or let me put it this way, all the studies on the Nazi democide that gave the collective title of all those who were killed, still indicate that the majority of victims were Jews. And they were the target of the most intense hatred and contempt from the Third Reich. I mean, the architects of the final solution, Hitler, Eichmann, Heydrich, Himmler, they had a specific coordinated hatred for the Jews. And all those other groups they considered enemies or inferior, but specifically the Jewish people, because of course it was the Jewish people they blamed for the Great Depression, among other things. And what I find troubling is the same sort of anti Semitic conspiracy theories that helped galvanize the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich can still be seen today. Like it's Jewish media and the Jews control the world and all this sort of thing. Um, Even if you were to recognize that there is perhaps a high proportion of Jewish people in business and in media, it totally ignores the fact that the Jewish people are diverse. They're as diverse as any other group of people. There are rich Jews and there are poor Jews. There are left wing Jews or right wing Jews. So that is why these sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are so damaging because they take the whole group and they say they are one and the same. Now I condemn crude generalizations of any demographic. If someone said all Muslims are terrorists, I would take issue with that. If someone said all Chinese are, fanatical communists, I take issue with that. So it's just common sense. Those sort of generalizations are dangerous. It is true that there's been a lot of media coverage of the Holocaust. There's been many films. You just have to turn the TV on in the middle of the day to see how many documentaries there are on the Nazis. And I think that gets a bit tiresome sometimes. But I don't think it's actually possible to overdo the Holocaust in terms of coverage because the scale was so big. I mean, we're talking the generally accepted figures around 6 million people killed. The vast majority of, well, that's 6 million Jewish people killed. That isn't including the hundreds of thousands of those other groups that I mentioned. And if we consider the war crimes committed by the Nazis, although it has to be said the Soviet Union also committed war crimes, and that shouldn't be overlooked, such as the killing of the Polish officers by the NKVD. Um, but I think a lot of the backlash against the idea of Holocaust Memorial Day, some of it is about, well, what about the other groups? And I think that's misplaced because I don't think the other groups are necessarily ignored. It's just that most of the victims were Jews. By the numbers, they were. Um, but then the other criticism is coming from people who flatly deny it even happened. Apparently, a study indicates 1 in 20 Britons believe the Holocaust didn't happen. That's troubling. 1 in 20. I imagine in parts of the Middle East it's far higher. In a country like Turkey, you probably find a very high proportion of people believe it never happened. You get demagogues like the former Iranian leader Ahmadinejad who talk about academic research and they try to guise it under freedom of expression, but it's academic fraud. That's what it is. Because there is ample evidence that the Holocaust happened. Just ignore the sentimental side for a second and focus on the facts. And the facts are there was abundant evidence to show that it happened. I mean, if you really think it was all made up or it was exaggerated, how do you explain those young American Marines and British and others who liberated Auschwitz and saw what they saw? Are they liars? Are they making it up? How about the extensive sites in Poland and Germany that are now museums? Is that all fake? I mean, what about the survivors? Are they lying? I think at some point you have to just recognize that this was a massive crime. It happened, and it is right that it is remembered. Of course, this doesn't mean that individual Jews are above criticism. Like anyone else, they're individuals, and I don't think that every criticism of someone who happens to be Jewish should be framed as anti-Semitism. But the Holocaust happened, and it is right that it is remembered. That brings me to the next issue. 75 years since the Siege of Leningrad. It is remembered, understandably, in Russia every year. Um, I've got total contempt for the current Russian administration under Vladimir Putin. I believe his regime is a threat to my country and to world stability. And I would not be half surprised if Putin uses events like this to sort of stoke up nationalism and bolster propaganda for the present day Russian military. Nevertheless, it's understandable that Russia remembers Leningrad. Leningrad was a bloodbath, and it was an absolute humanitarian disaster. Anywhere from 1 million to 4 million people perished. Um, Operation Barbarossa, the figures are up to 5 million as a whole campaign. So, well, I should say Leningrad, 1 million people perished. There was 4 million casualties, I believe that's included, sick, wounded. I mean, it was hell on earth. I think being in Leningrad from 1941 to 1944 must have been the absolute epitome of hell on earth. Stalingrad was also a bloodbath, and other major conflicts on the Eastern Front. I say conflicts because battles and sieges sometimes there's blurred lines, battles, sieges, campaigns. I mean, this was total war on an unimaginable scale, and it has been described as the most intense warfare in human history, and that includes some of the ferocious fighting that was in the Pacific War and even the Western Front of World War One. Of all conflicts in human history, The Eastern Front of World War II is described as the most intense, with up to 21 million Soviet dead. It's utterly staggering. Utterly staggering. So it's right that it is remembered. I mean, if we look at World War II fatalities, the Soviet Union's at the top, followed by China, um, and I believe third was Germany, in fact, then Poland. I believe from the figures I recall, it was the Dutch East Indies, present day Indonesia, was very high. Um, Many of them would have been civilian prisoners of war. Well, civilian victims of war, really. Um, Britain and America, whilst not wanting to minimize our losses, were quite low down the scale. We each lost around 400. I think the figure for Britain was 450,000 dead, military and civilian. The United States, 430,000 dead. Um, massive figure. But that's dwarfed by the 21 million who died in the Soviet Union. So it's right that it's remembered. And I'm going to conclude this video with a few thoughts. Um, Referring back to that video I made on why is the excesses and the mortality of communism not remembered in the same way as the Holocaust? I believe it should be. And I believe there should be something along the lines of Victims of Communism Memorial Day, but it shouldn't be regarded as kind of a counter to Holocaust Memorial Day. I think it's not a case of it being some sort of morbid competition. I think Holocaust Memorial Day is vital. I think it should be there. But the point about communism is contemporary China totally whitewashes the millions who died under Mao, and I think that is, I would call it the biggest deception in modern human history. How the Chinese government has hidden the crimes of communism from the Chinese people, or at least tried to cover it up. I would call that the biggest deception of modern history anywhere. Um, and I do think it is right, or it is time, that the excesses of communism were really fully explored. So, yes, I do want to see more films about the horrors of communism. There was a film made about 2 or 3 years ago about the Holodomor in Ukraine. I believe it was called Bitter Harvest. So, I think film can be a very powerful medium. I want to see more films about China's Cultural Revolution, about the Great Leap Forward. These were crimes against humanity. But the thing about communist regimes is they weren't atrocities committed against another country or against minorities. They were atrocities committed against their own people. So, had the Nazis killed millions of ordinary German civilians, there is a chance that it wouldn't be remembered in the same way. I think it's fair to say that. I think that's why communist atrocities are not nearly as documented, although in overall mortality, no ideology killed as many people as communism in the 20th century, including fascism, because whilst fascism was pure evil, it was over a concentrated period of time. If we look at the case of the Third Reich, 12 years, whereas communism lasted decades. So that's the difference. But I do think liberal democracies need to seriously consider having some sort of Victims of Communism Memorial Day. Of course, the left would create a stink about it because the left are well, I should say, some on the left are professional apologists. I mean, take for example the Morning Star newspaper. Certain members of Jeremy Corbyn's cabinet are plain communism apologists, um, which I find revolting. But I do think we need to have some sort of communism Memorial Day, and that wouldn't be in opposition to Holocaust Memorial Day. It would just be in its own merit. I think that's very important. I think there should be a museum opened about communist atrocities because right now there's nothing. There is nothing in China. There's no memorial. Films are heavily censored. Discussion is certainly censored. It's right that we remember the Holocaust, but I want in my lifetime to see a situation where Mao's crimes and Stalin's crimes, particularly Mao, because even Russia has been a little bit more forthcoming about Stalin's crimes. The State Duma recognized, for example, that the Holodomor was a man-made disaster. China remains incredibly dishonest about its past, and I think that is an utter tragedy. So it is right that we remember the Holocaust, but I do think that communist successes should also be remembered, and for that matter, excesses of other ideologies. I mean, Belgium, for example, should recognise the millions who died under Leopold II's regime in the Belgian Congo. But I really feel wary when people try to minimize the Holocaust or question it. That's just academic fraud.